20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 1. The Narwhale. In the year 1866, everybody in Europe and America was excited by a mysterious object that sailors and ships often saw at sea. This object was long and round, and often glowed with light under the water. It was much longer than any whale that had been seen before, and it could move very fast. All over the world, everybody talked about it and asked what it could be. Scientists from every country wrote articles, gave lectures, and talked about the animal. What was it, they asked, and did this monster really exist? In 1867, the problem changed from a scientific problem to a serious danger. On April the 13th, the steamboat Scotia was in the northeast Atlantic. At 4:17 p.m., the boat was hit by a sharp object, and water quickly went into the boat. The captain told the passengers to stay calm and told them that there wasn't any danger. He then continued to sail the ship to Liverpool. When the engineers looked at the boat, they couldn't believe their eyes. 2 meters below the watermark, there was a large hole in the shape of a triangle. The newspapers wrote about the story, and the public demanded that the monster must be caught. At the time these things were happening, I was returning from a scientific trip in the United States of America. I was waiting to go back to my job as professor in the Paris Museum of Natural History. As I waited in New York before my trip back to France, I was asked by the New York Herald newspaper to explain the problem. Here is what I wrote on April the 30th, 1867. The ocean is totally unknown to us. What happens there? What animals can live 15 or 20 kilometers under the sea? We do not yet know all the living things that live at the bottom of the sea. The common narwhale or sea unicorn is often 30 meters long. If the size and strength is increased by 10, then this could be the animal we are looking for. The narwhale has an ivory tusk just like an elephant, which is as hard as iron. If this weapon were 10 times stronger, then it could make a large hole in the ship. Therefore, until I get more information, I have to think that the monster is a huge narwhale. Professor Aronnax, Paris Museum. The US Navy read my newspaper article and made plans for an expedition to catch the narwhale. A very fast black boat called the Abraham Lincoln was prepared and loaded with guns and weapons. 3 hours before the Abraham Lincoln left, I received the following letter. To Mr. Aronnax, Professor of the Paris Museum, 2nd of July. Sir, if you would like to join the expedition of the Abraham Lincoln, the United States government will be happy to have you aboard. Captain Farragut has a cabin waiting for you. J.B. Hobson, U.S. Navy. Conseil! I shouted in an impatient voice. Conseil! Conseil was a loyal man from Holland, who came with me on all my journeys. Did you call me? He said. Yes, my boy. We must be ready to leave in 2 hours. Where are we going? He answered. You know about the monster, Conseil, the famous narwhale? We are going to catch it. We arrived at the Abraham Lincoln and I was introduced to Captain Farragut. He was a good seaman and his sailors liked him very much. He gave everybody guns and harpoons to attack the animal. One of the sailors was a man called Ned Land. He was 40 years old, tall and strong. He was known as the King of Harpooners and could throw a harpoon with a lot of speed and strength. However, Ned Land didn't believe in the narwhale. But if the narwhale doesn't exist, how do you explain the Scotia's accident? I asked. Because it's not true, he answered. On July the 20th, we arrived in the North Pacific, and for the next 3 months looked everywhere for the narwhale. We saw nothing. By November the 2nd, the captain and the crew were ready to stop looking, and so decided to spend only 3 more days looking for the whale. For 2 days we didn't see anything that looked like a giant narwhale. But at 8 o'clock on November the 5th, Ned Land shouted, "Look out! The thing we are looking for is on our starboard side." We all looked out at the sea. The animal was under the water and was lit by a very strong light. Seeing the size of the whale, the captain ordered the boat to be turned around and we desperately tried to escape. but it followed us, and then, after a few moments of panic on board, it disappeared. No one slept that night thinking about the whale. At 8 a.m. the monster came back, and I could see that it really was 40 meters long. This time, however, we were prepared for the shock of seeing such a beast. "Is your engine ready?" asked Captain Farragut. "Yes, Captain," answered the engineer. "Well, let's go." Our ship chased the animal all day, but at no time did we manage to catch it. "So," said Captain Farragut, "the animal goes faster than my ship. Well, we'll see if he goes faster than a bullet." With this, he picked up his gun and fired. The bullet hit the narwhale, but didn't go in and simply fell into the sea. The animal disappeared again, but later that night we saw the electric light only 5 kilometers away. It looked like it was asleep. We sailed up to it quietly and stopped about 100 meters away. Just then, Ned Land threw his harpoon. It hit the hard body of the narwhale and fell into the sea. Suddenly, the electric light went out. The animal dived under the water, leaving a huge wave behind it. As the wave came nearer, everyone looked for something to hold on to. I was too late and was thrown dramatically into the sea. When I came to the surface, I looked around. It was very dark, and all I could see was my black ship disappearing into the distance. "Help! Help!" I shouted desperately, but the ship was too far away and nobody could hear me. Before I had time to consider my situation, somebody grabbed me. "Conseil," I cried, "did the wave throw you into the sea too?" "No," said Conseil, "I jumped into the sea to save you." At that moment, we touched something hard. It was huge, and we managed to climb onto it. "Ned!" I cried when I saw him. "Were you also thrown into the sea?" "Yes, sir, but I climbed onto this floating island." "An island? This isn't an island," I said. "It's the giant narwhale, but it's made of thick iron." I hit my foot against the animal and heard a metallic sound. The narwhale wasn't an animal, it was a machine. Suddenly a metal door opened, 8 men appeared and pulled us down into the strange metal machine. Chapter 2. Captain Nemo and the Nautilus. We were taken down a ladder into the machine and pushed into a room. The door closed behind us with a loud bang. The room was made of iron and had a table and 5 stools. It seemed to have no door. About 30 minutes later, 2 men came into the room. One man was short with broad shoulders, strong arms and a thick black moustache. The other man was tall and about 50 years old. He had a straight nose and a wide forehead. He had very strange eyes. The 2 strangers were wearing hats made from sea otter fur, sealskin boots, and clothes made from a strange material. The tall man seemed to be the boss. He looked at us without speaking, then turned to his friend and spoke to him in a language I couldn't understand. The other man answered by shaking his head. "Maybe," said Conseil, "if you tell him the story of how he got here, they would understand." So I began talking in French about our adventures on the Abraham Lincoln without leaving out a single fact. I gave our names and jobs and asked the men where we were. They didn't seem to understand and didn't say anything at all. Next we tried talking in English, German and even Polish. Then the strangers went away, locking the door behind them. 5 minutes later a steward entered and brought us clothes similar to the clothes that the strange men were wearing. He set the table and brought out some large dishes of food. "I bet there's nothing good to eat here," said Ned. "Shark burgers, tortoise liver and sea dog steak." However, the food was excellent, and after we had eaten, we felt tired and fell asleep. When we woke up, the air was fresh and we could smell the sea. It was obvious that we were on the surface of the ocean. "We must do something," said Ned. "We must escape, and quickly." To escape from a prison on land is very difficult, but to escape from a prison at sea will be impossible, I said. Well, we must do something, cried Ned angrily. Suddenly the door opened, and before I could stop him, Ned attacked the steward who had just entered the room. He was choking him with his big, powerful hands. Just then, I heard these words spoken clearly in French. Calm yourself, Mr. Land, and you, Professor, please listen to me. It was the tall man with the strange eyes who spoke. Ned Land let go of the steward, and we waited for the tall man to continue speaking. Gentlemen, I speak French, English, German, and Polish very well. I know now that I am in the presence of Mr. Pierre Aronnax, Professor of Natural History in the Paris Museum, his servant Conseil, and Ned Land, harpooner on board of the Abraham Lincoln of the US Navy. I am sorry I've been so long in not talking to you, but I wanted to think about what to do with you. I have the right to treat you as enemies since you chased me and tried to destroy my submarine. But we thought we were chasing the sea monster that caused so much trouble in Europe and America, I said. However, continued the man, I don't have to give you hospitality on my submarine, and I could throw you out into the sea and forget about you. That is my right. I left human society and do not obey its laws. But I have decided that you can stay on my submarine, and you will have freedom to live with us. I will give each of you your own cabin to live in. However, no one on Earth knows about my submarine. It is a secret, and I will not allow you to ever leave the submarine. So we will never see our country and families again? That's cruelty, I cried. Sir, said the man, you are my prisoners. You have a simple choice, to drown in the sea or live a comfortable life on board my submarine. However, you will have the opportunity to study the ocean and see what no man has ever seen before. You will have a wonderful life on board my submarine. There followed a moment of intense silence, only broken by my friend. But what is your name? Asked Conseil. Captain Nemo, answered the man, and my submarine is called the Nautilus. Now, gentlemen, breakfast is ready. Over breakfast, he explained how all the food, clothing, and furniture on board the submarine was produced by the sea. After breakfast, he said, Now, Professor, if you want to see the Nautilus, I will show you around. I stood up and followed him into another large room. It was a library. There were big wooden bookcases containing a huge number of books, brown leather sofas, and desks to read on. Captain Nemo, I said, this library is bigger than any other library I have seen. How many books do you have? 12,000, Mr. Aronnax, he replied. You are welcome to use these books. I even have a copy of your book, Great Submarine Grounds. Then he opened another door, and we went into another big room. It was an enormous museum. There were pictures painted by the most famous artists, a large piano, and a huge collection of sea plants, shells, and other things from the sea. Captain Nemo must have spent millions of dollars collecting them all. But how does the Nautilus work? Where do you get the power from the engines? And where do you get all this electricity when you are under the sea? I said. Come this way, he said, and took me through another door into his own cabin. He showed me all the equipment on board. Then he explained that he had discovered how to make electricity from seawater. This electricity was used to power the submarine, to give light and heat. He explained that the Nautilus had large tanks on board. If these large tanks were filled with seawater, the submarine would sink to the bottom of the sea, and by pumping the water out of the tanks, it would rise back up to the surface. Ah, Captain, I cried, your Nautilus is certainly a marvellous boat. Are you an engineer? How did you manage all this without anyone finding out? Yes, I am an engineer, Professor. I studied in London, Paris, and New York, and I built the Nautilus in a secret place on a desert island, he said. One last question, Captain. Are you rich? Yes, Professor, he said. I am very, very rich. Chapter 3. Walking at the Bottom of the Ocean. "Now, Professor," said Captain Nemo, "I am going up to the surface." He pressed an electric bell 3 times, and the pumps started to pump water out of the tanks. The Nautilus started to rise, and then suddenly stopped. "We have arrived," said the captain. We climbed the iron ladder and went out onto the platform on top of the Nautilus. The sea was beautiful and calm, and we couldn't see anything except for the sea. The captain made some calculations and then said, "Mr. Aronnax, we are 400 kilometers from Japan. Today, November the 8th, we start our journey under the sea." We went back down into the submarine, and I met Ned Land and Conseil in the museum room. We talked about what we had seen and where we were. "I have seen and heard nothing," said Ned Land. "Well, Ned, the only thing to do is to keep quiet and watch what happens," I said. "Watch?" exclaimed Ned. "But there's nothing to watch in this iron prison." Suddenly, the light went off and a shutter opened. A large glass window was in front of us, and a bright electric light shone out into the water. "Wow, it's like being in an aquarium," said Conseil, and for the next 2 hours we watched, fascinated by the many different kinds of fish and sea animals swimming next to the Nautilus. For the next 8 days we travelled under the sea, and only came to the surface to get more air. I didn't see Captain Nemo at all, but on November the 16th I found a note in my room. To Professor Aronnax. Captain Nemo invites Professor Aronnax and his friends to go hunting tomorrow in the underwater forest of the island of Crespo. Captain Nemo. The next day I woke up and got dressed and went to the museum room where Captain Nemo, Conseil, and Ned Land were waiting for me. After breakfast, we followed the captain to a special room and put on heavy diving suits which were made of rubber and had arms, legs, and heavy boots. We put on our metal helmets and were given a special underwater gun. We followed Captain Nemo into another small and very dark room. The door was closed, and then the room began to fill with water. When it was full, a door in the side of the Nautilus opened and, not really believing it was happening, we walked out onto the bottom of the sea. We saw many interesting things, and soon we were walking through thick mud and seaweed. After an hour and a half, the ground sloped downwards, and we arrived at the forest of Crespo Island, which was made of huge tree-like plants. It was incredibly beautiful, unlike anything I had seen on land. At 1 o'clock, we stopped to have a rest. We lay down on the soft seaweed and I fell asleep. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, there was a huge sea spider that was just about to jump on me. Captain Nemo took his gun and killed the spider, and I realized that many other, more dangerous animals might live here at the bottom of the sea. I must be more careful, I thought. We walked on and reached a narrow valley between 2 high cliffs. We lit our lamps and continued walking down and down. At about 4 o'clock, a wall of rock appeared. It was the island of Crespo and was impossible to climb. We stopped and turned around and started walking back to the submarine. Suddenly, Captain Nemo picked up his gun and shot an animal which had swum in front of us. It was a magnificent sea otter with a beautiful fur coat. He picked it up and we continued on our journey. After walking for another hour, we saw the Nautilus in the distance. Just as I saw it, I felt Captain Nemo push me to the ground. After a moment of panic, I looked up and saw 2 dangerous dogfish pass by without seeing us. Again, I had been saved by the captain. We climbed back into the submarine and took off our diving suits, and I went back to my room and immediately fell asleep from exhaustion. What an adventure! For the next few weeks, I didn't see Captain Nemo very much. I spent most of my time reading and working in the library, and we continued on our journey. We passed the Sandwich Islands, Tahiti, the New Hebrides, and by January the 4th we were near Papua New Guinea. We were going through the Torres Straits, which are the most dangerous straits in the world. Suddenly, I felt a shock, and I was thrown to the floor. The submarine had hit a small island made of coral and had stopped moving. Captain Nemo came into the museum room looking worried. "We have had an accident," he said. "We are stuck in this coral island, and we will have to wait 5 days until the water level is higher. Then we will float off." We were near land, and Captain Nemo allowed us to take the small boat and go to shore. So, at 8 o'clock the next morning, we rowed towards the mainland. Ned Land was extremely happy. "Meat," he said. "We're going to eat meat." We searched hard, and on our way we collected coconuts, bananas, mangoes, and pineapples, and took them back to the submarine, but Ned wasn't satisfied. "We must find animals. We must have meat," he said. The next day, we went back to the mainland and caught a wild pig. We cooked and ate the pig, and in the afternoon we caught some small kangaroos. At 6 o'clock, as we were returning to where we had left the boat, I noticed a stone fly past me and hit the boat. We looked around and saw what must have been 100 native men running towards us. They had bows and arrows and were shooting at us. In panic, we jumped into the boat and quickly rowed back to the submarine. "Captain," I cried, "we have a problem. There are 100 dangerous natives outside." "Mr. Aronnax," answered the captain, "if all the natives on Papua New Guinea were on the shore, they wouldn't be able to hurt us." At 6 o'clock the next morning, the natives were still there, and I realized they weren't going to leave. By 11 o'clock, they had surrounded the Nautilus in their small boats. By the evening, some of them had climbed on top of the submarine and were shouting and screaming, but they couldn't get inside. I went to bed, and I must say that I didn't sleep very well. In the morning, the natives were still on top of the submarine, making a terrible noise. At 2:35 p.m., the submarine started to float, and a few minutes later, the Nautilus sailed under the waves, and the natives all fell into the sea. Chapter 4. Pearl Fishing and the Secret Tunnel. By January 21st, 1868, we had travelled 6,000 leagues of the Pacific, and we were sailing across the Indian Ocean. On January the 28th, we were near Sri Lanka, and I met Captain Nemo in the library. "Sri Lanka is very famous for pearl fishing," he said. "Would you and your friends like to see where they grow?" "Yes, I would like very much," I said. "But, Mr. Aronnax, I hope you are not afraid of sharks." "Sharks?" I cried. "Don't worry," he said, laughing. "We will have weapons with us." "It could be dangerous, but yes, I'll be ready." I told Ned Land and Conseil, and they were very excited. The next morning, I woke up at 4 o'clock and went into the museum room to meet Captain Nemo and my friends. 5 sailors from the Nautilus were waiting in the small boat and rowed us towards the shore. At 6 o'clock, we put on our diving suits, and I said, "Where are our guns?" "Guns?" said Captain Nemo. "What for? Here is a knife. This is all you will need." "Okay, let's go." Rather frightened, I put on my metal helmet and climbed out of the boat into the water. We followed the captain down a hill and under the waves and went down and down. At the bottom, we stopped where Captain Nemo pointed to a huge oyster. Inside the oyster, I could see an enormous pearl. It was as big as a coconut and was probably worth about $4 million. I stretched out my hand to take it, but the captain stopped me and shook his head. We turned around and walked back up to the shallow water. Suddenly the captain stopped, and he pointed to something. About 20 meters away, an Indian man was diving into the sea collecting oysters. He didn't see us, and we watched him collecting oysters from the bottom of the sea. Just then, a huge shark with its mouth open swam towards the Indian. Within seconds, Captain Nemo had jumped up and stabbed his knife into the shark's stomach. The sea went red, and all I could see was Captain Nemo fighting with the shark through clouds of blood. He fell on the ground and was just about to be eaten by the shark when Ned Land jumped in and killed the shark with his harpoon. The captain walked to the Indian and helped him back to his boat. The poor Indian man was clearly very scared to see us in our metal helmets and rowed away quickly. We walked back to the Nautilus and took off our diving suits. "Thank you, Ned," said the captain. "You saved my life." The next day, we left Sri Lanka and sailed towards the Sea of Oman. Ned wanted to know where we were going. "I think we must be going to the Red Sea to visit the oceans of Egypt," I said. On February the 11th, the Nautilus entered the Red Sea, and on that day I met Captain Nemo on the platform. "Well, Professor, do you like the Red Sea?" he asked. "Yes, Captain," I answered. "It is very beautiful." "Unfortunately, we cannot go through the Suez Canal. However, we will be in the Mediterranean the day after tomorrow." "In the Mediterranean?" I cried. "But how will the Nautilus move over the land between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean?" I asked. "Mr. Aronnax," he said, "the Nautilus will pass under the land through an underwater tunnel." When I told Ned Land, he said, "Impossible, we will see." However, later that night, while Conseil and Ned Land were asleep, I watched as Captain Nemo sailed his submarine through a narrow tunnel and out into the Mediterranean. The next morning, the Nautilus went back up to the surface. I went up to the platform with Ned and Conseil. "Where are we?" said Ned. "We are in the Mediterranean. Look and you will see the coast of Egypt," I said. "Wow! You're right! The captain is a very clever man. But now we are near Europe, we must escape," he said. I didn't want to stop my friends from leaving, but I personally didn't want to leave Captain Nemo. "If Captain Nemo offered you freedom today, would you accept it?" asked Ned. "I don't know," I replied. "But if we try to escape, we must be successful first time, because if we fail, we won't have another chance." "I agree," said Ned. "We must find a good opportunity to escape. For example, if we are near the coast, we could take the small boat at night and row to the shore." "Okay," I said. "When we find a good opportunity, Conseil and I will be ready." On February the 14th, I realized that the Nautilus was traveling towards Crete and the Greek islands. After breakfast, I went to the museum room and began to work. I studied until 5 o'clock, when I started to feel very hot. This was very strange because the sea shouldn't change temperature. I continued with my work, but it got hotter and hotter. I wondered if the submarine was on fire. Just as I was about to leave and look for help, Captain Nemo came in and said, 42 degrees centigrade. "I can feel it, Captain," I answered, "and if it increases, I hope you realize that we will all die." "The heat won't increase unless we want it to," he said. "Look, we are sailing through boiling water." The metal shutter opened, and I saw thick sulphurous smoke that smelt like bad eggs rising from the water. "Where are we?" I asked. "Near the island of Santorini. There is an underwater volcano here which makes the water very hot." "Well, we can't stay here any longer," I said. "No, of course," he replied. "We will leave at once." He pressed an electric bell and the Nautilus turned around and left the boiling sea. Half an hour later, we were breathing fresh sea air at the surface. On February the 16th, we left the Greek islands and sailed west. During the night, we entered the western Mediterranean, and instead of fish and sea plants, all we could see were shipwrecked boats at the bottom of the sea. We saw anchors, cannons, bullets, and pieces of broken ships. They were all covered in rust and seaweed. Some of these ships had crashed into other ships, while some had hit rocks and sank. As we came closer to the Straits of Gibraltar, I noticed more and more shipwrecks. How many sailors had died here, I wondered. Had anyone survived to tell the story? In the meantime, the Nautilus was travelling on at full speed amongst the shipwrecks, and on February the 18th, at about 3 o'clock, we passed through the Straits of Gibraltar. A few minutes later, we were at the surface and sailing on the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Chapter 5. The Atlantic. We had been sailing for 3.5 months and had travelled nearly 10,000 leagues. Now the Nautilus was sailing on the Atlantic. I walked out onto the top of the submarine with Conseil and Ned Land. We could see Cape Vincent in Spain, and we were travelling up the coast of Portugal. The sea was very rough, and we all went back downstairs to my room. "Tonight we escape," said Ned Land seriously. "We agreed to wait for a good opportunity, and by tonight we will only be a few kilometres from Spain." He came closer to me. "This evening at 9 o'clock, he whispered. "At that time Captain Nemo will probably be in bed. We will go to the stairs and out onto the platform. We will take the small boat and put it into the sea. Then we will row to Spain. Everything is ready for tonight." Then Ned Land and Conseil went to their rooms to wait for the evening. At about 6 o'clock, I heard the tanks filling up with water, and the Nautilus went under the waves. I stayed in my room and waited. At 7 o'clock, I ate my dinner. I got dressed in my sea boots, sealskin hat, and warm clothes, and went into the museum room. Suddenly, I felt a shock, and realized that the Nautilus was on the bottom of the ocean. How could we escape when we were at the bottom of the sea, I thought. At that moment, Captain Nemo came into the museum and said, "Ah, Professor, I was looking for you. Do you know the history of Spain?" "Not very well," I replied. "Well, on October the 22nd, 1702, a battle took place on the sea in Vigo Bay. English ships destroyed many Spanish ships, which sank to the bottom of the ocean. However, the Spanish ships were full of silver, gold, and jewels." Just then, the metal shutters opened and I looked out of the glass window into the water. The whole ocean was lit by a strong light, and I could see sailors from the Nautilus in their diving suits. They were collecting all the gold, silver, and jewels from wooden boxes on the sea floor and bringing them back to the Nautilus. "This is the place where the Spanish ship sank," said Captain Nemo. I could see shipwrecks of a whole fleet of ships, and each one of them had boxes and boxes of gold, silver, and jewels. "Now do you understand why I am so rich?" he said, and smiled. "All I have to do is collect all this treasure." When the sailors had finished, they came back to the Nautilus and we continued sailing under the sea. Our plan to escape had failed, and so I went to bed. The next morning, the Nautilus went up to the surface and we all went up to the platform. We couldn't see anything except for the sea, and we were sailing southwards away from Europe. Ned was very sad. "Well, Ned, we don't have a lot of luck, do we?" I said. "No, the captain stops every time we want to escape," he replied. "But next time we will be successful." Later that evening, Captain Nemo came to see me. "I have an idea, Mr. Aronnax," he said. "You have seen the bottom of the sea during the day. Would you like to see it on a dark night? It will be a difficult walk, and we will have to climb an underwater mountain." "I would like to go very much," I replied. "Okay, let's go," he said, and we put on our diving suits. It was midnight, and the water was very dark. Captain Nemo pointed to a red glow in the distance, and we started walking towards it. As I looked at the red light, I realized that it shone from the top of an enormous underwater mountain. At 1 o'clock, we reached the foot of the mountain. The path was full of seaweed, and I had to climb over rocks and dead underwater trees. I followed Captain Nemo up the mountain, and we didn't stop once. But Captain Nemo went on and on, higher and higher. After quite a climb, we were at the top, and I looked down the other side of the mountain. There was a huge volcano, and I could see red fire coming out of a hole in the bottom of the mountain. On the ground next to the volcano, I could see a town. It was completely ruined, but I could still see houses, churches, and streets. Captain Nemo wrote the word Atlantis on a rock. We stayed there looking at the lost underwater city for an hour. Then the captain pointed back down the mountain, and we made our way back to the Nautilus. The next day, I woke up very late. The shutters were open, and I could see that we were travelling over Atlantis. At 4 o'clock we passed the Canary Islands, and we were travelling across the Sargasso Sea. From February the 23rd to March the 12th, the Nautilus travelled south. The sea was empty, but sometimes we saw ships going to America or the Cape of Good Hope. Where were we going? I thought. Were we going to the South Pole? On March the 14th, a group of whales swam alongside the Nautilus. We were sitting on the platform. Captain Nemo came onto the platform to look at the whales. "Look over there," he said, and pointed at something in the distance. "Do you see those black animals swimming towards us? They are killer whales. They are cruel animals, and they kill other whales. We must attack them before they kill all the whales in the sea. The Nautilus has a huge metal harpoon at the front, and we will attack them with it." We all went down into the submarine and looked out of the glass window. The Nautilus started to kill the whales, and after an hour we all went back up to the platform. The sea was covered with dead whales, and the Nautilus was floating in a sea of blood. Captain Nemo sailed next to the dead whale, and 2 sailors climbed on top of it. They took all the milk from its udders and pumped it into large glass bottles. The captain gave me a glass of fresh whale milk. It was still warm, and the smell made me feel sick. "It's delicious," he said. "It's different from cow's milk, and is very important for making butter and cheese." I risked the taste, and actually it was delicious. Then the Nautilus left the Sea of Blood and travelled on towards the South Pole. Chapter 6. The South Pole. On March the 14th, I saw ice floating in the sea. The further south we went, the more ice we saw, and it became thicker and thicker. 2 days later, the sea had frozen into an ice field, but the Nautilus was strong and broke the ice as it sailed through. However, the next day, the Nautilus got completely stuck. "It's the Ice Bank," said Ned Land, and we could see ice mountains in the distance. "No one can pass the Ice Bank," he said. "All there is behind the ice is ice, ice, ice." I went up to the platform to have a look. The captain was there and said, "Well, Professor, what do you think of it?" "I think we are stuck, Captain." "Where are we going?" "To the South Pole," he answered. "But we can't get through the Ice Bank," I cried. "That's true, but we can go under it. Once we get under the Ice Bank, we will get to the sea at the South Pole." Preparations were made to go under the Ice Bank, and at 4 o'clock the captain told me that everything was ready. The Nautilus went under the sea. It went down and down, and through the glass window we saw the Ice Bank disappear. I couldn't believe that we could get so low, but it was true. We were travelling under the Ice Bank. The next day, I went back to the museum room and watched as we slowly started to go back to the surface. The Ice Bank became thinner and thinner, and suddenly we broke through the thin ice and out into the open sea. I went up to the platform on top of the submarine. I saw many different kinds of birds, and the sea was full of fish. It felt like spring. "Are we at the South Pole, Captain?" I asked excitedly. "I don't know," he replied. "I must do some calculations." We got into the small boat and rowed to the shore, got out, and walked to the top of a mountain. At the top, the captain measured the position of the sun in the sky. He did some calculations and smiled. "I, Captain Nemo, on March the 19th, 1868, have reached the South Pole," he said proudly. Then he stuck a large black flag with the letter N written on it into the ground. We were the first people to get to the South Pole. The next morning, we left the South Pole and travelled under the Ice Bank again. We had travelled 14,000 leagues, and I had seen many interesting things. I went to sleep that night dreaming of all the places we had been to. Suddenly, I woke up with a shock. The Nautilus was lying on its side. I went to the museum room and met Conseil, Ned Land and Captain Nemo. "We have had an accident," he said seriously. "An enormous block of ice turned over, and we are stuck on the ice. It is pushing us upwards. If the block of ice doesn't stop, we might be crushed against the ice bank." For the next 5 minutes, the whole ship was in a state of deep horror. Was the block going to stop? We looked out of the window and could see the ice bank above us. We were sure that this was the end. But suddenly, we all fell forward as the enormous block of ice stopped. I looked out of the window and saw the ice bank right above us. "Wow, that was close," I said. "Another 30 meters and we would have been crushed against the ice bank." Ice was on both sides of the submarine, and all that we could see was a huge wall of ice. Above us was the ice bank. Below us was the enormous block of ice. We were in a tunnel of ice. The only way to get out was to go forwards or backwards until we found a way out. The captain started the engines, and the Nautilus moved forwards through the ice tunnel. A minute later, it hit ice. The tunnel was blocked. So the captain started to go backwards through the tunnel. It moved through the tunnel for about 25 minutes and then hit the ice again. Ned Land and Conseil looked worried. "What's happening?" shouted Ned Land. "Where is the captain? We must find out what's going on." The door opened and Captain Nemo came in. For a moment he didn't speak. "We have a problem," he said seriously. "We are stuck in this tunnel of ice. Above us there is the ice bank. Below us there is the block of ice. Both forwards and backwards are blocked." "What are we going to do?" cried Ned Land. "I don't know," replied the captain. "We are trapped. There are 2 ways we might die. The first is to be crushed to death by the ice. The second is to suffocate, as we don't have very much air. The air tanks will only give us 2 days of air. But we can put on our diving suits and start digging the ice." The ice was about 10 meters thick, and about 12 sailors from the Nautilus went out to dig the ice. Ned Land, Conseil and myself went with them. After 12 hours of work, we had only dug a small part of the ice. It was taking a long time to dig through the ice, and we didn't have much air left. The next day, we continued digging the ice, and we dug about 6 meters of ice. The air inside the submarine wasn't very good, and I got a serious headache. By the next day, there were only 2 meters left to dig. I lay down on my bed. I had no strength. My head and my lungs were hurting, and it was difficult to walk as there was almost no air left. Everyone was desperate. Later that evening, Captain Nemo decided he would try to use the submarine to break through the ice beneath us. All the sailors came back into the Nautilus, and the tanks were filled with water to make the submarine heavier. The captain started the engine. The Nautilus started to push down against the ice. It was pushing and pushing, when suddenly we heard a loud cracking noise. The ice below us broke and the submarine was free. But we were still under the ice bank and had no air, but we travelled as fast as we could towards the open sea. I was lying on a sofa in the library. My face was purple and my lips were blue. I couldn't move, and when I opened my eyes, I couldn't see. I don't know how long this lasted, but I knew I was dying. How long would it take to get to the sea, I thought. Hours and hours went by, and the Nautilus was still travelling as fast as it could. Suddenly, I felt pure air in the submarine. I breathed and stood up. It was still difficult to walk, but I climbed up onto the platform and breathed in the fresh sea air. Slowly my strength came back to me. Ned Land, Conseil, and Captain Nemo were all on the platform, and we thanked God we were still alive. Chapter 7. The End of the Journey. We were alive and happy to be alive. But what would Captain Nemo do now, I thought? Would we go back to the Pacific, or would we travel towards the Atlantic? I soon realized that the Nautilus was sailing towards South America, and on April the 16th we saw the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. We had travelled for 17,000 leagues, and I thought that the journey would never end. On April the 20th, we passed the Bahamas and we sailed towards America. Later that morning, Ned Land pointed to something out at sea, and 5 minutes later, the Nautilus was surrounded by hundreds of small octopuses. "I have heard of giant octopuses that can drag a ship down to the bottom of the sea," said Conseil. "Do you believe in giant octopuses?" "No, I don't," answered Ned Land. Just then, out of the window, we saw something very big. "Look, a giant octopus!" said Conseil. We couldn't believe our eyes. The octopus was enormous. It was about 12 meters long and was swimming towards the submarine very quickly. It had huge green eyes and 8 long tentacles. It had its mouth open and we could see its large, sharp teeth. At that moment the Nautilus stopped and the captain came into the museum looking worried. "One of the octopus's tentacles is stuck in the propeller," he said. "We will have to kill it." All the sailors went up to the platform on top of the submarine, and before anyone could do anything, the octopus picked up a sailor and lifted him into the air. "Help! Help!" he cried. Captain Nemo and the other sailors cut off 7 of the octopus's tentacles, but the last tentacle was in the air holding the poor sailor. Just then, the octopus sprayed a huge cloud of black liquid. We couldn't see anything, and when the liquid disappeared, the monster wasn't there. Captain Nemo stood still and looked out to sea. He was crying because one of his sailors was dead. We had now been on the Nautilus for 7 months, and we were travelling up the coast of America. I decided to speak to Captain Nemo about when we would be free. I knocked on his door and went inside. The captain was working at his desk. "I would like to speak to you, Captain," I said. "But I'm busy, Mr. Aronnax," he replied. "Captain," I said, "we have now been on your submarine for 7 months. I would like to know when you will let us leave the Nautilus. When will we be free?" "Mr. Aronnax," he said, "I have the same answer now as I gave you 7 months ago. Whoever enters the Nautilus never leaves it." I told Conseil and Ned what the captain had said. "Well, we must escape," said Ned Land, "as soon as possible, as soon as the weather is good." However, on May the 18th there was a storm, and we had to travel east. We left the sea near New York and sailed towards England, and on May the 30th we saw Land's End. Later that day I heard a loud explosion. "What was that noise?" "A gunshot," answered Ned Land. We were on the platform, and I looked out to sea. I saw a large warship which was about 10 kilometers away. It was sailing very quickly towards us. I heard another shot, and a cannonball landed in the water close to the submarine. "Why are they firing at us?" asked Conseil. "Maybe they think we are the narwhale," I said. Just then Captain Nemo came onto the platform and said, "Go downstairs. All of you go down into the submarine." "What are you going to do, Captain?" said Ned Land. "I have no choice but to attack and destroy the warship," he said. We all went down into the submarine, and it went under the waves. However, it didn't go down to the bottom of the sea, but it stayed just under the surface. The captain pressed a button, and the Nautilus started to go faster and faster towards the warship. Suddenly, it hit the warship and went straight through it. The enormous warship started to sink, and I could see all the sailors drowning in the sea. I felt terrible because I couldn't do anything to help them. The warship disappeared under the water and sank to the bottom of the ocean. Captain Nemo went to his room. I could see him and saw that he was looking at a photograph of a young woman and 2 small children. He started to cry and kissed the photograph. Later that evening, I saw that the Nautilus was going through the English Channel. I couldn't sleep that night and thought about the terrible things Captain Nemo had done. The next morning Ned Land came to see me. "We are going to escape tonight," he whispered. "Yes, Ned, we will go tonight," I said. "The sea is rough and the wind is strong, but we will take the small boat and row to the shore. We will leave at 10 o'clock, he said. "I will be ready," I said. Later that evening, I put on my warm clothes and boots and lay down on my bed. I thought about everything that had happened on board the Nautilus. Hunting near Crespo Island, Torres Strait, the natives of Papua New Guinea, the Red Sea Tunnel, the Mediterranean, Santorini, Atlantis, the South Pole, the giant octopus and the sinking of the warship. All of these things went through my mind as I thought about escaping. At 10 o'clock, I left my room, walked quickly through the museum room, and met Ned Land and Conseil in the library. "Let's go," I said, and we climbed up the iron ladder. Suddenly, the Nautilus started to spin around and around. I realized that we were caught in a whirlpool. We climbed onto the platform and tried to get into the small boat. The Nautilus was spinning around and around, and I knew that we wouldn't escape. Just then, there was a huge crash and a terrible noise. I hit my head on the iron platform and lost consciousness. I don't know what happened next, but when I woke up, I was lying in a fisherman's hut on an island near Norway. Conseil and Ned Land were there. We were all safe. It is here that I decided to write the story of our adventures under the sea. I don't know what happened to Captain Nemo and the Nautilus. Is he still alive? Did the Nautilus survive? Or was it destroyed in the whirlpool? Maybe we will never know.